I thought my son was my flesh and blood, someone I could trust with anything. But in a single moment he proved me wrong. That was the moment everything changed. Margaret's heart sank as she stood in her living room, staring at the empty space where her son had once stood. The house was silent now, the once warm walls filled with nothing but the echo of her disappointment. Her hand shook slightly as she picked up the phone, hoping for an explanation. It had been weeks since she last spoke to him. Her son John was a successful businessman, married to a woman who seemed sweet at first. But everything she had known about him, his values, his love for his family, had come crashing down like a house of cards. The sound of the phone ringing was louder than ever. She hadn't expected to hear from him today. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, but this wasn't it. The voicemail beeped. "Mom, I need you to listen closely. I'm not coming back. Everything we had is gone and I've moved on. Don't try to reach me." Margaret's stomach tightened. Those words hit harder than anything she could have imagined. It was like being stabbed with a knife, but instead of blood, it was her heart that was bleeding. How could he do this to her? The woman he'd married, Susan, had always been a mystery. Margaret had tried to like her, tried to accept her into their family, but something about her never felt right. It was as if she wore a mask, hiding her true intentions. Margaret had always told herself that things would work out. John would come to his senses. But now she knew. She was just fooling herself. As she stood there holding the phone in her hand, she realized the truth. John had stolen everything they had worked for, the house, the business, their legacy. And he had done it with Susan, the woman Margaret had never trusted. The tears were gone now. There was no point in crying over spilled milk. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound she had ever known. Margaret had been a mother for over 40 years. She had sacrificed so much for her children, always putting their needs first. But now she was left with nothing but the remnants of a family that had turned against her. Her son had become a stranger, and the woman who had once been her daughter-in-law was now her enemy. As the days passed, the weight of the loss became unbearable. She tried to reach out to John to find out what had gone wrong, but each call went unanswered. The silence was suffocating. It felt as though the entire world had turned its back on her. Margaret didn't know what to do. Her life, which had once been filled with love and purpose, now seemed like an empty shell. She had given everything to her family, and they had taken it all from her. She didn't know where to turn, who to trust, or how to begin to rebuild. But one thing was clear. She couldn't let this betrayal go unpunished. She had raised her son to be a man of integrity, but somewhere along the way, he had lost his way. And Susan, the woman who had wormed her way into their lives, was now at the center of it all. Margaret had always believed in the power of family. She had always believed that, no matter what, her son would be there for her. But now she knew better. It wasn't just her son who had betrayed her. It was her entire family. And she was going to make them pay. With every passing day, Margaret's resolve grew stronger. She would fight for what was rightfully hers. She would fight for justice. But most of all, she would fight for herself. The woman who had once been the heart of her family was now determined to take back what was hers. The battle was just beginning, and Margaret was ready to face whatever came next. The days after John's message passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Margaret sat in her living room, staring out the window at the changing seasons. The world outside seemed so full of life, yet inside, she felt trapped in an endless void. The house, once filled with the sounds of family gatherings, now echoed with silence. Every corner of the house reminded her of what she had lost. She had always prided herself on being the strong, reliable mother. She had built a life for her children, sacrificed everything for their happiness. But now she couldn't help but wonder if it had all been for nothing. She had worked so hard to create a home, to give them everything, only to have it taken away in the blink of an eye. And for what? For a son who no longer recognized the woman who had raised him. Margaret had tried to convince herself that she was overreacting. Maybe John was just going through a phase, or maybe he needed time to sort things out. But deep down she knew better. She had seen the signs for months, even before his disappearance. The way he had grown distant, the way he had stopped coming over to visit. The excuses about work, about life getting in the way. But now it was also clear. Margaret had given so much to her family, But in return, she had received nothing but betrayal. She couldn't remember the last time John had called her, or the last time he had come to her with a problem. It had been years since he had looked at her the way he used to, with love and respect. Instead, he had become cold, distant, and selfish. And Susan, the woman who had once seemed so sweet and kind, had turned out to be the one behind it all. Margaret had never trusted her. There had always been something about her that rubbed Margaret the wrong way. At first, she had chalked it up to jealousy, to being protective of her son. But now she knew the truth. Susan had wormed her way into their family, manipulating John to turn against his own mother. The more Margaret thought about it, the angrier she became. She wasn't just angry at John or Susan. She was angry at herself. She had let this happen. She had let them take everything from her without putting up a fight. She had always believed that family was everything, that love and loyalty were the foundations of a strong relationship. But now those values had been shattered. Her son had become a stranger, and the woman he had chosen over her was nothing but a thief. Margaret wasn't sure what to do next. She had spent so many years taking care of everyone else, never once considering her own needs. Now, as she sat alone in her living room, she realized how much she had neglected herself. She had poured all her energy into her family, into making them happy, but had she ever truly made herself happy? The thought was too painful to bear. But as the days dragged on, something inside her began to shift. Margaret wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let her son and his criminal girlfriend get away with what they had done. She had spent too long putting others first, too long sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of a family that had turned its back on her. It was time for her to fight back. But how? She wasn't sure yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to sit by and let this betrayal destroy her. Margaret had always been a survivor. She had faced hardships before, and she had always come out stronger on the other side. Now she was going to use that strength to take control of her own life again. She wasn't going to let her son's actions define her. She wasn't going to let Susan win. And most importantly, she wasn't going to let herself be forgotten. It was time for Margaret to take back what was rightfully hers, and she was going to do whatever it took to make sure that happened. I had never felt more alone than I did in those days after John's message. The house, which had once been full of laughter and warmth, now felt cold and empty. Margaret sat in the quiet of her living room, staring out the window as the world moved on around her. The leaves had begun to change color, marking the passing of time, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time itself had stopped for her. The life she had known, the life she had worked so hard to build, was gone. She felt the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. Margaret had spent years caring for her children, putting their needs above her own, sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of her family. But now, with everything falling apart, she wondered if it had been worth it. She hadn't been prepared for this. She had always believed that family was everything, that loyalty and love would always hold them together. But now those values felt like a distant memory. John, the son she had raised, the one she had trusted more than anyone, had taken everything from her and vanished without a trace. And Susan, the woman Margaret had tried to welcome into their family, was the one pulling the strings behind it all. Margaret had always known there was something off about Susan. At first, she had chalked it up to her own insecurities. She had wanted to like Susan, to accept her as part of the family. But deep down, something had never felt right. There was always something cold in Susan's eyes, something that didn't sit well with Margaret. She had tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just her being protective, but now it was clear. Susan had manipulated John, using him to get what she wanted. Margaret couldn't help but feel betrayed, not just by her son, but by the woman who had wiggled her way into their lives. She had never trusted Susan, but now she had proof that her instincts had been right all along. As the days passed, Margaret's anger grew. She was angry at herself for not seeing the truth sooner, for not protecting herself and her family. She had spent so much time caring for others that she had forgotten to care for herself. But now it was time to change that. Margaret wasn't going to let John and Susan get away with this. She had spent her entire life making sure her family was taken care of, and she wasn't about to let them destroy everything she had built. She had lost so much, but she wasn't going to lose her dignity. She wasn't going to let them think they could take everything from her and walk away without consequences. Margaret wasn't sure what to do next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to sit idly by. She had to fight. But how? She wasn't sure yet. The thought of confronting John, of standing up to him after everything that had happened, made her stomach turn. But she knew that if she didn't do something, they would walk all over her. Margaret had always been a woman of action, someone who took charge when things went wrong. She had raised her children with love and discipline, and she had always tried to teach them right from wrong. But now it was time to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The first step was figuring out what had really happened. Margaret needed to know everything. She needed to understand how John had become the man he was and what role Susan had played in all of this. She started by going through old family records, looking for any clue that might explain what had gone wrong. She looked through photos, old letters, and even the legal papers she had kept from when they bought the house. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Margaret wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she had to keep digging. As the days passed, she started to uncover things she hadn't expected. John had always been a private person, but there were hints of things in the past that Margaret had missed. Small signs that pointed to trouble, to a man who had been slowly drifting away from everything they had built together. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized how much she had been blind to. It was as if she had been living in a fog, unable to see the truth until it was too late. Margaret couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. She had missed the signs, had let her guard down, and now she was paying the price. But there was no time for guilt now. She had to focus on moving forward. She had to find a way to take control of the situation. Margaret wasn't sure what her next move would be, but she knew she wasn't going to let this go. She had worked too hard to let her family fall apart, and she wasn't about to let it all slip away without a fight. It was time for Margaret to take back what was hers, and she would do whatever it took to make sure that happened. The house had never felt so empty. Margaret had spent days sitting alone, contemplating what had happened, piecing together fragments of memories, trying to make sense of everything. The once familiar smell of the kitchen, the sight of family photos on the wall, now all of it felt foreign to her. She could no longer recognize the people she had loved for so many years. It was as if the world had shifted beneath her, and she had been left behind, stuck in the rubble of her own life. But Margaret wasn't the kind of woman to stay down for long. She had always been strong, even when life had dealt her cruel blows. She knew that if she was going to regain control, she had to take the next step. She couldn't keep sitting around, feeling sorry for herself. It was time to make things right. Margaret knew that confronting John directly was not going to be easy. She had tried to reach him, but his silence had only reinforced the walls between them. He had made his choice, and now it was her turn to make hers. She wasn't going to beg him for answers. She wasn't going to chase after him, hoping for some glimpse of the son she once knew. No, this time she was going to take action. Margaret decided to start by confronting Susan. She had always known that Susan was behind it all. The woman had been a master of manipulation from the start. At first, Margaret had tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but now she knew better. Susan wasn't just a passive bystander in this betrayal. She had been the architect of it all. Margaret had always trusted her instincts, but this time they had been telling her the truth all along. It was time to call Susan out, to make her face the consequences of her actions. Margaret knew she couldn't do this alone. She reached out to an old friend, someone who had always been there for her. Emily had been a close friend for years, someone Margaret had confided in during the hardest moments of her life. Emily had always supported Margaret no matter what. When Margaret explained the situation, Emily's reaction was immediate. "You're not alone in this," Emily had said, her voice firm. "We'll figure it out. You deserve answers, Margaret. And you deserve justice." Margaret wasn't sure what that justice would look like, but the support from Emily gave her the strength she needed to keep going. Together they started gathering information. Margaret had never been one to back down from a challenge, and now she had a purpose. She was going to expose the truth, no matter how painful it was. The first step was finding out where Susan had been hiding all these years. Margaret knew that Susan had connections, people who would do anything to help her. But Margaret wasn't intimidated. She had lived through enough to know that people like Susan thrived on fear, And Margaret wasn't about to let that happen. The more Margaret learned about Susan, the more she realized how deep the manipulation had gone. It wasn't just the money or the house, it was everything. Susan had played John like a puppet, pulling the strings until he was too far gone to see the truth. Margaret couldn't believe how easily her son had been swayed. She had raised him better than that. She had taught him right from wrong, but somewhere along the way he had lost his way. The realization hit Margaret hard. She had spent years building a family, a life that she thought was secure. And now it was all crumbling around her. The pain of that loss was almost unbearable, but Margaret was determined not to let it break her. She had to keep moving forward. The next few days were a blur. Margaret and Emily worked tirelessly, reaching out to people who might know something about Susan's whereabouts. It was exhausting, but every lead they followed brought them closer to the truth. And then one afternoon they got a break. A call came through from an old acquaintance of Susan's. The person didn't want to be identified, but they had information that could help Margaret. It turned out that Susan had been living under a different name for years, hiding in plain sight. Margaret could hardly believe it. It wasn't just the betrayal from John. It was the fact that Susan had been living a double life, using her son and his family to get what she wanted. Margaret knew this was her moment. She had the information she needed to confront Susan, to take back control of her life. But she also knew that this was going to be the hardest thing she had ever done. Confronting Susan wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her peace of mind. Margaret wasn't going to let this woman destroy her any longer. It was time to face her fears, to stand up for herself and her family. The day of the confrontation arrived, and Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt more nervous in her life, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. Susan had made her life a living nightmare, and now Margaret was going to make sure she paid for it. She walked up to Susan's door, her hands trembling slightly, but her resolve stronger than ever. This was it. This was her moment to take back control. The door opened and there stood Susan, as cold and calculating as ever. For a moment neither of them spoke. It was as if the weight of everything that had happened hung between them, suffocating the air. Margaret finally broke the silence. "It's over, Susan. You've taken everything from me. But I'm done letting you control my life." Susan's eyes flickered with surprise, but her mask quickly returned. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice laced with venom. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything?" Margaret didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth. It's over." The look in Susan's eyes was almost predatory, but Margaret didn't back down. She was ready. She had already won. The days after the confrontation with Susan were a blur of emotions. Margaret had left her home that day with the weight of a decision she had never thought possible. For years she had fought to protect her family, to hold everything together. But now she was learning that some battles were better fought alone. The silence that had followed her departure from Susan's doorstep was deafening. Every part of Margaret's being told her to turn back, to give in to the familiar pain of the past. But she knew deep down she couldn't. She had to stay strong. She had to keep moving forward no matter how much it hurt. The first few days after her visit to Susan felt like a fog. Margaret's mind was racing, her heart heavy with a sense of betrayal she couldn't shake off. She had spent so many years believing in the goodness of her family, and now it seemed like that belief had been shattered into pieces she couldn't put back together. She had tried to reach out to John, tried to understand why he had made the decisions he did, but each attempt ended in silence. No answers, no explanations, only the cold indifference of a son who had turned his back on her. It was as if he had become someone she didn't even recognize. The pain of that realization settled into her bones. Margaret had always believed that love and loyalty were the foundation of family. But now it seemed as if those very values had been twisted and used against her. As she sat in her empty home, Margaret could feel the weight of everything she had lost. But in that emptiness something shifted. The anger she had felt before was replaced by a quiet resolve. She was done letting them control her life. She was done letting them take everything from her. Margaret didn't need to wait for John's apology or Susan's admission of guilt. She had already made up her mind. She was going to take back her life and she would do whatever it took to make that happen. But first she needed to find closure. She needed to understand the full extent of the betrayal before she could move forward. Margaret knew that Susan had played a significant role in all of this, but she also knew that John had to be held accountable. He had chosen this path, and now it was time to face the consequences. Margaret wasn't about to let him off the hook, not after everything he had done. The next day, Margaret reached out to her lawyer. It was time to make it official. She wasn't just going to let Susan walk away from this without facing the truth. The meeting with the lawyer was long, but it was necessary. Margaret had all the evidence she needed. Susan's manipulations, John's neglect, everything that had led to this moment. She wasn't going to let the people who had taken advantage of her get away with it. The more she talked with the lawyer, the more empowered she felt. This wasn't just about getting revenge, it was about reclaiming her dignity. It was about standing up for herself after years of being silenced. Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, there would be moments of doubt, but she was ready. She had spent too many years letting others dictate her life. Now she was going to take control. As she left the lawyer's office, Margaret felt a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was finally moving in the right direction. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret believed that maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life. Her journey wasn't over, but she had taken the first step. And that was all that mattered. She knew that the truth would eventually come out. She wasn't going to let her son and Susan destroy her. Margaret had spent her life fighting for others, and now it was her turn to fight for herself. The following weeks were a whirlwind of decisions, actions, and silent contemplation. Margaret felt as if she was living in a haze, still processing everything that had happened. The fight for her life, the life she had worked so hard to build, had only just begun. She had started by taking small steps, reaching out to the people who might help her, starting with her lawyer. She had to gather everything, every piece of evidence, every scrap of proof that would show the depth of the betrayal. But even as she took action, the emotional weight of it all weighed heavily on her. She spent hours looking through old documents, receipts, letters, and photographs. Every piece of paper felt like a reminder of what she had lost. Each family photo, each letter from John, once filled with love and affection, now felt like a distant memory from another life. But Margaret knew that she couldn't dwell on the past anymore. The past was gone. She couldn't change what had happened, no matter how much she wished she could. The only thing she could do was keep moving forward, keep fighting for herself and for the future she wanted to build. It was hard. There were days when she felt like giving up, when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. But then she would think about what John had taken from her. The house, the memories, the future they had once planned together. He had destroyed it all. And she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Margaret had been a mother for so many years, and she had always done what was best for her children. But now she was finally starting to do what was best for herself. She was going to fight for the life she deserved, the life that had been stolen from her. It wasn't going to be easy. There were still so many unknowns, so many questions. She still didn't know where John had gone, or why he had made the choices he had. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to stop until she had answers. She couldn't stop. Margaret spent the next few days gathering everything she needed to confront John once again. She wasn't sure what would happen when she saw him, but she had to face him. She had to get him to understand the gravity of what he had done. She wasn't sure if he would even listen to her, but she had to try. The thought of standing before him again made her heart race. She had raised him, loved him, and now he was the one who had turned his back on her. The idea of having to confront him after everything was almost too much to bear. But Margaret wasn't going to let fear stop her. She had spent her life being the strong one, the one who held everything together. Now it was her turn to take control of her own life. She wasn't going to let John or anyone else dictate her happiness anymore. Margaret finally made the decision to visit the last place she knew John had lived. It wasn't much, just a small apartment in the city, but it was all she had. She didn't know if he would be there, but it was worth a shot. She needed to know where he had gone, why he had left, and what had driven him to do what he had done. When she arrived, the building felt unfamiliar, cold. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her, the finality of it all. This wasn't just about finding John. It was about finding closure. Margaret stepped into the building, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked up the stairs to his apartment, unsure of what she would find when she reached the door. She had no plan, no script, just the raw emotion of a mother who had been betrayed by the one person she had trusted the most. She knocked, her hand trembling slightly. She waited, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment there was silence. And then the door opened. Margaret froze. Standing before her was John, his face blank, emotionless. He didn't seem surprised to see her. In fact, it almost seemed like he had been expecting her. The years of love and devotion she had given him seemed to evaporate in that instant. There was no warmth in his eyes, no sign of the boy she had raised. "What are you doing here?" John asked, his voice flat, almost disinterested. Margaret swallowed hard, trying to steady her shaking hands. "I need to understand why you did it. Why you chose her over everything we had. Why you stole from me, from us." John's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond. Margaret could feel the weight of his indifference. It was as if the person standing in front of her wasn't her son at all. "I raised you to be better than this," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I loved you with everything I had. And this is how you repay me." John's gaze dropped, his eyes shifting to the ground. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look sorry. He just looked tired. "It's over, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm done. You can't change it. I made my choice." Margaret's heart shattered in that moment. The realization hit her harder than any words ever could. Her son was lost. He had made his choice, and nothing she said or did could bring him back. But that was the moment she realized something important. John wasn't the only one who had lost. She had lost him, yes, but she hadn't lost herself. She was still here. And that was enough. Margaret stood there for a moment longer, taking it all in. She wasn't going to beg him to come back. She wasn't going to beg him to love her again. She had done enough of that in the past. It was time to move on. She turned and walked away, her heart heavy but resolute. She was going to rebuild her life piece by piece. She had been through so much, but she wasn't going to let this break her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be hers to walk. Margaret had taken back control of her life. And nothing, not even her son's betrayal, could take that away. The days that followed were a mix of clarity and confusion. Margaret had spent years giving everything she had to her family, but now she was learning to reclaim her own life, piece by piece. After the confrontation with John, the reality of the situation settled over her. Her son had made his choice. He had turned his back on everything they once shared, and no amount of pleading or begging could change that. It hurt deeply, more than she could have ever imagined. But the truth was becoming clearer every day. Margaret had to let him go. She had to let go of the image she had held onto for so long. The image of her son who loved and respected her. The image of a family that would stand by one another no matter what. That son was gone, and the family she once knew had unraveled in front of her eyes. But in the midst of that unraveling, something began to change in Margaret. The sting of betrayal was still there, but there was also a sense of freedom. She wasn't tied to the life she had known anymore. It was time to build something new, something that was just for her. The first step was simple, but it felt monumental. Margaret had spent so many years living in a world that revolved around her children, her family, their needs, their dreams. Now she had to rediscover her own. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed down on her. Moments when she doubted herself and her ability to start over. But there was something inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. A spark of determination, of a will to keep moving forward, to take control of her own future. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Margaret started going to the gym again, something she had put off for years. She began cooking for herself, making meals that she enjoyed, not just the ones that catered to her family's tastes. She began to reclaim the space she had lost, bit by bit. But it wasn't just about the physical changes. Margaret was also working on herself emotionally. She reached out to friends she hadn't spoken to in years, people who had always been there for her, even when she had forgotten about them in her role as mother and caretaker. She began to realize how much of herself she had buried beneath the weight of other people's expectations. It was freeing but also terrifying. What did she want now? What kind of life did she want to build for herself? She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she was done living in the shadow of her past. One afternoon, as Margaret was sorting through some old boxes in her attic, she came across a stack of letters from her late husband. He had always been a quiet man, not one for grand gestures, but he had written her letters over the years, simple notes of love and appreciation. As she read through them, Margaret realized something. Her husband had always believed in her. He had always known her worth even when she didn't. It was in those letters that she found the strength she needed to keep going. She wasn't just a mother. She wasn't just someone's wife. She was Margaret, a woman with her own dreams, her own desires, her own story. And she was going to start living that story again. It wasn't going to be easy. There were still moments when she felt the pang of loss, when she missed the family she thought she had. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Margaret was learning to let go of the past, to make peace with what had happened, and to look ahead to the future. The first big step came when she decided to sell the house. It was a painful decision, but it was one she knew she had to make. The house was full of memories, but those memories were no longer hers to hold. It was time to move on. Margaret found a small, cozy place in a neighborhood she had always loved. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was the first space she had truly owned in years, and it felt like a new beginning. As she settled into her new home, Margaret began to feel the weight of the past lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't completely free yet, but she was getting there. One day, as she was walking through the park near her new home, she saw a familiar face. It was Emily, the friend who had stood by her through everything. Emily smiled at her, a smile that was warm and genuine. "I knew you'd make it," Emily said. Margaret smiled back, feeling something shift inside her. She wasn't alone. She didn't have to face this new chapter by herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Margaret was ready for it. She had lost so much, but she had also gained something valuable. She had gained her freedom. And that was the start. Margaret walked on, her steps lighter, her heart a little less heavy. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was going to face it on her own terms. The quiet moments Margaret had been searching for were slowly starting to fill her days. Her new home, though small, had become a sanctuary. The soft hum of daily life, the small comforts she had missed, were now becoming her routine. Margaret had been through so much, but as each day passed, she felt a bit more like herself. There were moments of doubt, of course, when memories of the past crept in, when she found herself missing her family, her old life. But those moments were fewer and further between. Margaret was starting to realize that it was okay to miss what she had lost. What mattered now was what she was going to do next. She had spent too many years being defined by her role as a mother, a wife, a caregiver. Now she had the chance to define herself on her own terms. It was liberating but also intimidating. The future felt like a vast, uncharted territory. But Margaret was determined to walk into it with her head held high. She began taking small steps to reclaim her independence, to rebuild her life on her own. She enrolled in a painting class she had always wanted to take, something that had been a dream of hers long before the chaos had taken over. The first day she was nervous. She hadn't painted in years, and the thought of putting herself out there again made her anxious. But as she picked up the brush and started to work, something inside her shifted. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to impress anyone. She just needed to create. Margaret lost herself in the colors, in the strokes, in the way the paint came to life on the canvas. It was like she was rediscovering a part of herself she had forgotten. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She wasn't thinking about John or Susan or the betrayal. She was just focused on the present moment. The class became a weekly ritual, a time for Margaret to reconnect with herself and her creativity. It was more than just painting. It was about finding joy again in the simple things. As the weeks went by, Margaret's confidence grew. She started exploring other parts of her life that had been put on hold for so long. She joined a book club, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time for. She started walking in the mornings, letting the fresh air fill her lungs as she wandered through the neighborhood, taking in the beauty around her. The change was gradual but noticeable. Margaret began to feel like herself again, like the woman she had once been before everything fell apart. She wasn't defined by the betrayal or the heartbreak. She was her own person, capable of so much more than she had ever given herself credit for. But despite all the positive changes, there were still moments when the pain crept back in. Late at night, when the world was quiet and still, Margaret would lie in bed and think about what had happened. She would think about John, about how he had become a stranger, about the son she had raised and loved, only to be pushed away by him. The anger would rise up again, sharp and fierce. But Margaret had learned something important. She couldn't keep holding on to that anger. It wasn't helping her, it was only holding her back. She had to let it go. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt impossible. But Margaret was learning to forgive, not for John, but for herself. She needed to let go of the past so she could move forward. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could change how she let it affect her. As time passed, Margaret started to see the world differently. She saw the beauty in small moments, in the quiet mornings, in the laughter of friends, in the simple act of breathing in the fresh air. She realized that life, no matter how much it hurt, was still worth living. She didn't have to let her past define her future. Margaret's story wasn't over. In many ways it was just beginning. The road ahead would have its challenges, but Margaret was no longer afraid. She had faced the worst of it and she had survived. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. And now with each passing day she was building a life that was truly her own. Margaret's new life was still a work in progress, but as the months passed, the pieces of her existence began to fall into place. The grief, the anger, the frustration that had once consumed her heart were now becoming distant memories. In their place was something else, something that felt like freedom. The weight of her past had not vanished, but Margaret was learning how to carry it without letting it define her. The mornings were the best part of her day. She had started a new routine, one that focused on herself. A walk in the park before breakfast, breathing in the crisp morning air, was becoming a habit she treasured. It was her time, no one else's. For the first time in years, she wasn't chasing after the demands of others. She had spent decades putting her family first, but now she was finally allowing herself to come first. Her body, once tired and worn from years of neglect, was beginning to feel stronger. Her walks were turning into runs, and the lightness in her step was matched by the lightness in her heart. She had made peace with the past, and it was starting to show in the way she carried herself. But even as she moved forward, the question still lingered. What now? What did her life mean now that she was no longer defined by her role as a mother, as a caretaker? She was no longer tied to the family that had broken her heart. Margaret didn't have all the answers, but she was beginning to find herself again. The woman who had raised children, who had been the glue holding everything together, was rediscovering her own passions and interests. She had started volunteering at the local animal shelter, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time for. She enjoyed the simplicity of it, the way the animals greeted her with unconditional love, the way their eyes lit up when she took them out for walks. It felt like she was giving something of herself again, but this time it was for herself. Margaret had also reconnected with friends she hadn't seen in years. She started hosting small dinners, inviting people over, sharing laughs and stories over homemade meals. For the first time her life felt full in a way it hadn't before. It was the kind of fullness that didn't depend on anyone else. Came from within. One evening as Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, sipping tea, she realized something. She had survived. Not just survived but grown stronger. The pain of losing her son, of being betrayed by him and Susan, had been excruciating, but it had also taught her something she never expected to learn. It had taught her how resilient she was. Margaret didn't need anyone's approval. She didn't need her son's love to feel worthy. She was worthy of love and happiness on her own terms. That realization was more liberating than any victory she could have imagined. She wasn't waiting for someone to save her anymore. She had saved herself. And that was enough. Margaret had learned to trust herself again. She had spent so many years doubting her instincts, second-guessing herself. But now, when she made decisions, she did so with confidence. She had faced the darkness of her life and come out the other side. The woman who had once feared being alone now found peace in solitude. It wasn't loneliness, it was independence. And it felt good. As time passed, Margaret's relationship with her son began to shift. She hadn't heard from him in months, but one afternoon she received a letter. It was from John. Her hands trembled as she opened it, unsure of what to expect. But as she read the words, something unexpected happened. It was an apology. A simple, heartfelt apology. John had written about his mistakes, about how he had let his anger and his relationship with Susan cloud his judgment. He admitted that he had hurt her, and that he was sorry for the pain he had caused. Margaret's eyes welled up with tears, not out of anger or resentment, but out of relief. She had never wanted him to stay away, never wanted to lose him, but she had needed him to see the truth. And now it seemed he did. Margaret had spent so much time waiting for him to come back, but she realized now that she didn't need him to. She had found herself again, and that was enough. When she finished reading the letter, Margaret smiled. It wasn't the closure she had expected, but it was the one she needed. John's apology didn't fix everything, but it was a start. She knew that their relationship would never be the same, but that didn't have to be a bad thing. It was just another chapter in their story. Margaret closed the letter and placed it on the table. She had come a long way. She had built a new life for herself, and now she was ready to embrace whatever came next. There was still so much to discover, so much to experience. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Margaret was excited about it. She wasn't waiting for someone to give her permission to live. She was going to live on her own terms. The road ahead was hers to walk, and Margaret was ready to take every step with confidence.